Learning the meaning of the word seems quite simple. We can easily imagine what a typical word learning scene might look like. A child sits on the floor playing with her pet dog. Her mother says, "That's a dog." The child thinks, "So this animal I'm playing with is a dog." Put like this, the task of mapping words to their meaning seems quite simple. Unfortunately, when we delve a little deeper, we find that the task is not that simple. There are two main problems, the reference problem and the extension problem. In this video, we will discuss about these problems before we turn to some of the solutions offered by the word learning theorists. The focus here is on word learning in the early years, so the reader must be aware that the children continue to learn words throughout childhood, many of which they come across when they start to read books.
Good afternoon, everyone. For today, I am going to discuss to you the reference problem. It was eloquently described by the American philosopher William Van Orman-Quine in 1960. He called the reference problem as the problem of radical translation. In his thesis, Interdeterminacy of Translation, he said that there are always indefinitely many possible ways of translating one language into another. He also sees that a child's task is as equivalent as a linguist attempting to translate an unknown and radically different language. Every time a word is spoken, there are millions of things, ideas, and events that it might refer to. For example, the phrase "look dog." With the referential act, the word dog may have an indefinite numbers of hypotheses to which the word is referring to. Children may not know that in a language there is usually a word that describes a rabbit. A child may assume that the gavagay means that there is no word in our language for that animal. That is the problem inherent of learning words with observable things. Presumably, it is even harder to work out the meaning of a word that do not refer to things a child can see. In other words, reference problem is the problem of radical translation because in a native language there may be a different system of reference than another language. So there may be words that may mean more than one thing, just as we have an exact referential meaning and an abstract singular term at the same time.
Even after working out what a word refers to, the child has to work out what to extend the word to. In the example given in the beginning of this chapter, we imagined a little girl playing with her pet dog. Hearing her mother says, "That's a dog." Thus, learning that the word dog refers to her pet dog. But of course, this is not quite enough. The word dog can be used to refer to all dogs in the world, including those dogs look quite different from each other, like Chihuahuas or Labradors. In fact, dogs can be referred to imaginary dogs as well, like dogs in the cartoons, books, and pictures. However, dogs cannot be used to refer to cats, rabbits, or horses. Extension problem gets even more complicated when we consider that words do not map onto categories in the same way across languages. This means that children have to extend words in different ways depending on the language they are learning.
Constraints Theory Part 1. The Role of Innate Constraints. Constraints theorists argue that children word learning is guided by a set of default assumptions or constraints on hypothesis. What this means is that the children have innate guidelines about how to interpret new words. Theorists have suggested a whole raft of such constraints to guide children's learning, as well as the whole object assumption. Markman and colleagues have proposed the mutual exclusivity assumption. Learners should assume that objects only have one name. Thus, if you already have a name for an object, example dog, Assume that other words spoken in the presence of dog, example leg and running, are not alternative names for the dog, but refer to something about the dog. Example, part of the dog's action, the dog's location. This is the tendency of the children to suppose that an object has only one category label.
The taxonomic assumption, when learning how to extend a new word, assume that it will only extend to taxonomically related things, not thematically associated things. In other words, only extend the word dog in other member of the same category, dog, not things associated with dog. Example, bones. This is tendency of children to suppose that a novel word that refers to one things also refers to similar things.
Other constraints have been suggested by other authors, such as: first, the shape bias. This is said to bias children to label objects of a similar shapes with the same name. Second, the function bias. This is also said to bias children to label novel objects that have the same function with the same name. For example, objects you can use to pick up balls and deposit them in the chute. And lastly, pragmatic principle of conventionality and contrast. Conventionality refers to the idea that children assume that there is a conventional form that should be used in the language community. Contrast. Contrast is similar to the mutual exclusivity assumption and refers to the idea that children assume that any difference form indicate a difference in a meaning.
Constraints Theory Part 2, the Developmental Lexical Principles Framework. In response to critics, Gallenkoff and colleagues devised a version of constraints theory called the Developmental Lexical Principles Framework. They suggested that 6 principles organized into 2 tiers could do the job of learning words. In the first tier are the 3 principles that are probably innately given. These principles are essential for word learning to get off the ground and are available to the children from the beginning of the process. The first principle is the principle of reference. Children assume that words symbolize or stand for actions, objects, and attributes. The second principle is the principle of extendability. Children assume that words do not necessarily refer to a single example, but to a category of similar objects. The third principle is the principle of object scope. Children tend to assume 2 things about what the word refers. First is, the word referred to an object in the first place, and only apply to labels to actions and events if it is clear that the word does not refer to an object. Second, that words refer to the whole object, not a part of the object.
Second tier 3 principles. These 3 principles are not very powerful or constraining. That's why children make a lot of efforts. For example, children might incorrectly overextend words on the basis of shape similarity. They will use the word ball in all the round objects they will see, just like the moon. With only these constraints to have, word learning is slow and difficult. Thus, as children get older, they will develop more refined, sophisticated constraints to help them learn words. This is when second tier of principles develop. The first principle is the principle of conventionality. Children must learn to use the conventional meaning of words and abandon their own creations or family name. This tells that a children must know the fact that every meaning of every word listed differs from the other meanings. The second principle is the principle of categorical scope. Perceptual similarity is no longer an adequate basis for extension. Children now know that the words label taxonomic categories. First, at the basic level, the word dog. The superordinate of it is mammal and animal. This proves that children will believe new object labels refer to object within taxonomic categories. The third principle is the novel name nameless category principle. Children will now assume that a new word refers to an object or category that does not have yet a name. Unlike the mutual exclusivity assumption, the principle does not prevent children having two names for one subject. For example, Fido and the dog.
C. The semantic development of a child. Semantics is the understanding of word meanings and the relationship between words. Children's semantic development is a gradual process beginning just before the child says their first word and includes a wide range of word types. A 1-year-old can name some common objects, follow simple one-step directions, identify some body parts, answer basic yes or no questions, understand some location words, for example, in, on, understand simple what, where, and who questions. A 2-year-old can now also understand a variety of word types, for example, nouns, verbs, pronouns, preposition, etc. Understand some simple concept terms, for example, big or little. Begin to follow simple two-step directions. Include basic emotions words in vocabulary, for example, sad, happy, mad. Understand some basic grammatical markers, for example, the ENG, plural. A 3-year-old can now also name parts of objects, for example, wheel, door handle, etc. Sort objects into categories, for example, foods, animal, clothing, etc. Identify items that are the same or different. Understand exclusionary term not, for example, find the hat that is not blue. Use some shape, color, letter, and number of words. A 4-year-old can now also describe the function of common objects. For example, chair is for sitting, car is for driving. Describe differences and similarities between objects. Provide common antonyms, for example, wet versus dry, and synonyms, for example, fast and quick. Identify things that go together, for example, ball and bat, fork and spoon, from a smaller group of items. Describe an object using 3 or more adjectives, for example, size, shape, texture, appearance, etc.